Welcome to another episode of my Wake Up Call. This is the podcast where I find out a little bit about my guests, and then I want to find out a lot more about them. And in the process of finding out a lot more about them, you, our listeners and viewers, when these pop up as videos, you seem to like my finding out not only what my guests are about, but how they came to be about that. I'm excited to have Leslie Reyes as a guest today, and you'll understand why, because we'll talk about something that I don't think I've actually talked about in the podcast, and we're up to about 440 episodes. So let me tell you about her. She's the author of The Zen of Learning to Ride a Motorcycle. The Zen of Learning to Ride a Motorcycle. When I was much younger, probably before Leslie was born, there was something called the Zen of Motorcycle Maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
And that was an iconic book. She's a psychiatric and chemical dependency nurse, yoga teacher, and motorcycle enthusiast. She's seen mental illness up close, first as the daughter of a schizophrenic mother, and later through her own personal mental health struggles and challenges. She lives with her husband and their 5 motorcycles and 2 dogs in Northern California. She's also currently working on a second book, and we'll have her back for that, called Drowning Under the Spectrum: How Women Can Save Themselves from Being Misdiagnosed, Overlooked, and Abandoned and Learn to Thrive. And we'll look forward to that. Because it's about a conversation about the lack of autism research involving females. Too often people just think men have autism or on the spectrum, but it's something that affects women, and it's really misunderstood. So Leslie, welcome.
Wow, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, I'm happy to have you here. So I will ask you what I ask all my guests, which is, if you step back and think of what matters to you in life, besides your family, your dogs, your husband, what do you think it is that matters to you? And then tell us how that came to matter to you so much. And then I'm going to shut up and just listen, because I wrote a book with that title. So tell us your story about growing up, and then how you came to care about what it is you care about today.
Yes. Well, what I care about is having open conversations about depression, anxiety, suicide, codependency, and spectrum issues that can, especially women who are not diagnosed properly, they can end up having depression and anxiety because of misdiagnoses. I feel that it's still kind of stigmatized. I think people are afraid to really talk about when they're hurting emotionally and mentally, because they're afraid they're going to be isolated even further. I saw a quote. I don't know if there was a picture of Robin Williams, who we all know took his own life about a decade ago. And it said, people don't fake being depressed. They fake being okay.
Ooh.
So, especially during the holidays, people might seem okay, but I encourage everyone to reach out to their friends who are newly single or have had any major changes going on in their lives in the past couple months, because they might be afraid to let you know that they're feeling vulnerable. And that is something that became important to me, as you know, as we mentioned, because I was raised by a schizophrenic mother. And there was a lot of shame in that for her in particular. It was hard for me, even, when I started to become old enough to have relationships myself. I was always so afraid that it was something that was going to scare people if they knew that mental illness ran in my family, that maybe that made me a damaged person. So it's just, that's sort of what inspired me to become a psychiatric nurse, because there are so many wonderful people out there in the world that have so many gifts to offer, and they may be overshadowed by their own pain and suffering and whatever traumas they experienced in the past. I want people to be able to talk about it and not be afraid and not be this thing that people go, ooh, I don't know, that person's toxic. That person's so negative. I think we can, if we open up the conversation a little more, we can heal more. So that's in a nutshell how that became important to me.
So can you unpack a little bit of your childhood? Was there an increasing awareness that my mother is different than the other mothers, or uh, you didn't mention the level of severity? Did she have to be
Oh
hospitalized?
yeah. Yes, she was, and this is the early 1970s. I actually was alive when Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance was written in 1974, but I was only about 4 years old. And that was around the time that my mother started having problems. She had two late term miscarriages, which is hard for a person who doesn't have a history of mental illness or I think she told me that she was suffering for a long time, but she was able to hide it and sort of push it down. But when she became a mother, and then when she had those two miscarriages, I feel like that's what was her breaking point. It was, there's so much responsibility that there's no more energy to just hide or keep this illness at bay. So she would have, when she first went to the hospital, I thought it was because she had lost her baby. I didn't realize that there was a mental illness component to it until maybe a few years later, when it seemed that every springtime, because she had her two miscarriages, just both happened to happen around Easter. So it was always around Easter time. She would get very depressed and she'd have to go in the hospital. And my relatives tried to explain it to me. Oh, your mom has a chemical imbalance in her brain that makes her feel sad and depressed, when there's really nothing to be sad or depressed about. That's the way they tried to simplify it for me. But the hardest part for me was, um, I talk about this in my book. When I was 10 years old, around 10 years old, I was playing with a friend on a school night, and the friend wanted me to ask if I could sleep over. And I just felt like, oh, my parents are never going to let me sleep over on a school night. That's just not going to happen. But she begged me to ask my mom, and I just figured I'll humor her. I'll call my mom. My mom will say no, and she'll come pick me up. But my mom said yes. And she sounded very weird and said, oh, I think that would be a great idea if you slept over your friend's house. And I called her right back because something inside me was telling me that something was wrong. And, she basically admitted to me that she was going to kill herself. And she doesn't remember this. When I was an adult and I told her this story, she doesn't remember doing this. But it really, it changed. Something shifted for me at that time. I felt like my fight or flight response went into dysregulation, and I was always on guard and always afraid. And, I became reactive. I know I talk about impulsivity. I was never really a impulsive person, like to do physically dangerous things like ride a motorcycle. That was totally out of the box for me. But I felt like I was very emotionally reactive after that moment, because I thought, wow, if I hadn't listened to my instincts and called my mother right back, she would have died, and it would have been all my fault, because I felt responsible. As a child, you don't really understand what's going on.
Did,
So
did you have brothers and sisters? And
I
tell
did not. It was just me. And
Ooh.
my father wasn't home that night. I think he was down the street, actually, ironically, working on motorcycles with a friend of his, while that was going on. So yeah, so it was just me. um, yeah, yeah.
And what about your dad? What was his influence on you?
Well, he was, you know, he was really upset with my mother. Again, this is the 1970s.
Mhm.
I would like to get that idea that people who are suicidal are selfish, because it's usually the opposite. It's usually this idea that I'm a burden, I'm toxic, I'm negative, I make everyone depressed that's around me. So if I eliminate myself, then the world will be a better place. But my dad was very angry, and he told her if she ever did anything like that again, he would end the marriage. So that just kind of scared me. It's like, well, you can't be negative. You can't let people know what you're going through because they'll leave you if you do. But all of this is just, I don't hold my mother or my father responsible for this. They're just humans. They were struggling with something that really, this is now 50 years ago. It's not something that was openly discussed, or, there wasn't a lot of help. There was a lot of really bad medications, some really strong drugs. There was electric shock therapy, but there wasn't a lot of compassion or understanding about why somebody might be feeling this way.
And
So
are they still alive or together or?
they're no longer together because unfortunately my mother did have another incident a few years later. My dad is still alive. My mother passed away in 2011, but
Mm.
she never really recovered from, whatever it was that really triggered and made it hard for her to get a handle on her depression and her schizophrenia. She never was really able to overcome that. It was something that she struggled with for the rest of her life.
So let's pivot a little bit because, and thank you for sharing that. And
Sure.
thank you from our listeners for sharing that, because that gives us a good context to understand how you shifted to the Zen of learning to ride a motorcycle. Because what you're describing was situations that were anything other than Zen. I mean,
Yes.
reactive, uh, unpredictable, chaotic, um, hyper vigilant, those kinds
Yes.
of things. And so talk us through that, and then how you eventually got to this notion of the Zen of learning to ride a motorcycle. And then I want to share some things as well.
Sure. Well, I think the biggest lesson I learned when I learned to ride a motorcycle was looking in the direction you want to go and not where you don't want to go. And there was a lot of through a lot of my life, I was afraid of ending up just like my mother. When I was really young, I really admired her. She was a ballerina dancer. She was incredibly creative. She was bubbly. She was outgoing. And then it got to this point where it was just scary. She just could never seem to dig herself out of this hole. And I was absolutely terrified of ending up just like my mother. And then one day I found myself in a psychiatric unit, suicidal, sitting on a floor, trying to figure out how to get out of the life I'm in. And look at that. I had ended up just like my mother, you know. Um,
Can you say,
after,
talk more about that incident and what led up to that, and then get beyond that
yeah.
to what we're going to be talking about today with your book?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of trying to figure out what normal was in my life, having grown up in that chaotic environment, instead of just trusting myself to be who I was, just letting myself be myself. If I'm quirky, if I'm weird, that's okay. But I was so afraid of anything that was outside of quote unquote normal. And what is normal anyway? Is there really any normal? Is anybody normal? You know, um, I think that's, when I decided I could only be me. There's no other there, dying is not an option. Suicide's not an option. It's not going to make it's not, it's just not an option. I'm not a murderer. And I wasn't, you know, there was no other way to go but to realize that there's nothing on the outside, like even my motorcycle. That's not what cured me of my anxiety or depression. It was the mindset that I had to change in order to be able to ride the motorcycle that changed my mindset. It was just sort of this that just happened to be the thing, you know. Um, a person who rides a motorcycle safely can't be impulsive. You can't be reactive. You can't be hyper vigilant and over emotional or fearful, because all those things are going to make it dangerous for you to ride a motorcycle. And those are the same things that kind of make life kind of dangerous. If you are hyper vigilant or over emotional or overreactive, you're not going to be living a quote unquote Zen life. And being Zen, it could even be just leaning into sometimes recognizing, things are hard, things are difficult. That's just what it is. It's okay. I'm going to get through it. It is what it is. You can't always just run away from it. So I think, when I hit my rock bottom and I realized I was going to have to start learning how to trust myself, and it wasn't something that happened overnight. It wasn't like, Eureka, I'm not trusting myself and I just need to trust myself. It was sort of an uphill climb. But there was an incident where my uncle had died. And my father and my uncle are both from the Philippines, and they both emigrated over here, and they both rode motorcycles, and they were, really into cars and motorcycles and scooters and things like that. And most Filipino fathers are very overprotective of their daughters. And there was a very controversial incident that my cousin, who's about the same age as I am, she brought it up at his funeral, where she talked about how, she took one of the mini bikes. You have to understand, my uncle had like 10 cars and countless bicycles, motorcycles, dirt bikes, scooters in the garage. So the kids take out these little 50cc Honda scooter or mini bike, dirt bikes. And she tells the story about how she's probably about 6 years old, which is really young to be on a mini bike. But this is the 1970s, we were sort of let wild, and there's no helmets, no gloves, no safety or anything. And she hits a curb with the mini bike, the motorcycle, and flips over the handlebars, really messes the motorcycle up. And she thinks, oh, my dad's going to kill me. But instead, he calls her into the garage the next day and says, honey, you rode this motorcycle and you broke it. So we're going to the store. I'm going to show you how to fix it. And then you need to get back on it and ride it again, or you're going to be afraid to ever get on a motorcycle again. Now, if he had been like, oh my God, don't ever touch the motorcycle again, I don't know if her life would have turned out the way it is. She's a very successful emergency medical doctor in San Francisco. And she's been for about over 20 years now. When she told that story, something in me clicked. There was just, because I'd always seen my cousins, these daughters of that uncle of mine, as inherently brave, really grounded human beings. They're both they have great families, and they have very successful lives. And there was something in me that clicked, and I thought, you mean he just taught her, if you fall down, get back up, instead of freaking out or being fearful or being reactive or impulsive or hypervigilant and like screaming at her and telling her you could have died. He said, you fell down, you broke the motorcycle, you don't know how to fix it, so you have to learn, and you need to get back up. So that really inspired me. That's when I said to my husband, I want to learn how to ride a motorcycle. And he'd been riding since he was 13 years old. And he was like, are you kidding me? Because we were living in Los Angeles at the time. And that's probably one of the worst places to learn how to ride a street bike. But, I kind of in my head is like, well, if he's not going to help me, I'm just going to go learn how to ride myself. And I signed up for the MSF course, and I took a class, and the next thing you know, I was buying a motorcycle and buying a dirt bike, and I'm on my third motorcycle now. And I have fallen down. I have fallen down on that motorcycle. The first year I rode motorcycles, any motorcycle that I got on was going to get dropped. And I would just think of my cousin and my uncle and get back up. I got to get back up, and the same is with life. Sometimes you fall down. It's not the universe telling you that you shouldn't be doing it. It just means that you need to get back up and learn.
Mm-hmm. And so share some more things that you learned that are in the book about, because to me it was just such a seductive, wonderful title, The Zen of Learning to Ride a Motorcycle.
Yes. So, I had it actually, if you see my friend, Jen Sincero, she's the author of a New York Times bestseller, You Are a Badass.
Mhm.
She had always been telling me that she learned this concept that how you do one thing is how you do everything. And she was like, "Don't you get it? It's so great. Don't you get it?" And I'm like, "I get it, but how do I put it into practice?" And so when I started, you know, thinking of the concept is when you fall down, get back up, not just on the motorcycle, but in life. Look in the direction that you want to go, not where you don't want to go. Because on a motorcycle, we know target fixation. If you're looking at a telephone pole, you're going to ride your motorcycle into the telephone pole. So you have to kind of look in the direction you want to go. If the road is curving, you want to look into that turn. And like I mentioned, the same isn't true in life. I was so worried about not ending up like my mother instead of thinking about, well, what do you want to be? You don't want to be a schizophrenic, crazy person in a psych ward, but who do you want to be? I wasn't thinking of that. Um, so that was, I sort of went on a journey to figure out, okay, where did this idea come from? How you do one thing is how you do everything. And I found that it originated it was a Zen principle. If you're doing everything mindful, if you do one thing mindful, you train yourself to do things mindfully, you'll start doing everything mindfully. So that's why I named it the Zen of Learning to Ride a Motorcycle. Not that it's inherently so much a book about Zen philosophy, and it's not even really so much about riding motorcycles. It was just for me, that was the thing that I was finally able to apply that concept to. How you do one thing is how you do everything. So when I feel like I'm starting to go down this road of, oh, I don't want to end up broke and homeless, or, my mind starts catastrophizing because I've had one, setback in life, I think, well, where do you want to go? Look in the direction that you want to go. Another big one is understanding your limitations. We are not all, we don't all learn things at the same pace. We don't go through life at the same pace. If I start comparing myself to my cousin's life, my ER doctor cousin's life, I'm not really doing myself a service. I have to look at where am I in my life and go from there. It took me a good 8 months to get out of a parking lot when I was learning how to ride my motorcycle, because I had to keep respecting where I was. And if it was going to take me a little longer to get over the fear and anxiety, because I didn't want to go on the road full of anxiety. It's one thing to be concerned, and it's a dangerous sport to engage in, and you want to be alert and aware, but you don't want to be so anxious and fearful that it's distracting you from being safe. So it's really important to just know where you are and respect that and be okay with it. It's okay if you're not where your neighbor is or where your cousin is. It's okay to be where you are.
So something I'd like you to unpack, because
Hmm.
that's something, living mindfully.
Hmm.
I know about mindfulness, and I know that, when people talk about mindfulness, they're often talking about uh, an exercise of pausing to increase their awareness, breathing,
Hmm.
calming themselves down. And I hadn't heard the term living mindfully, because to mean being mindful is to is is to increase your awareness of where you are,
Hmm.
but you're really not going anywhere at that moment. In fact, you're kind of separating yourself from going anywhere so that you can be mindful, so that you can just be aware of your breathing. So that caught my attention, and it's kind of fresh, how to live a mindful life. So I don't know if
That's it is. It's exactly that. It's being where you are when you're there. I remember my nursing teacher, they talk about what's critical thinking. It's thinking about why are you thinking what you're thinking. So when I think about mindfulness, I think, one of the places that we are often not very mindful is when we're driving in the car, especially if you've had your license for a number of decades. You can be anywhere but what you're doing in the car. You're singing along to the radio, you're thinking about where you're going. I've done it in the past where I meant to drive one place and I automatically started driving somewhere else because I wasn't being mindful, because I wasn't living in the present. you're living at where you think you're going or where you want to be, instead of focusing on the traffic or focusing on, what the cars around you are doing. So living mindfully to me is just, focusing on what you're doing when you're doing it. And it sounds like the simplest thing in the world, but it really seems like we don't always do that. And when we're not living mindfully, that's when we do things like stub our toes or cut our fingers when we're chopping the onions, or drop our motorcycles because your mind is somewhere else. So being mindful is just trying to stay in the present. And I think, when the Zen Buddhist monks and they're in those gardens with the rake and the sand, it's just a practice. It's a practicing of just being where they are. And if you can carry that into other areas of your life, then you're always sort of living in your life. There's a saying that, and I think it's a Zen Buddhist saying. I believe it was the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu. He said, if you're living in the future, you're anxious. If you're living in the past, you're depressed. So the only place to live is in the present. And I'm sure I didn't say that exactly correctly, but that's the gist of what he was trying to say.
I love it. Let me ask you, and we can do this together, or you can fill me in. Can you apply that living in the present when you're in the middle of an argument with, say, your husband?
So I think yes and no. A lot of times I think that's reactive, right? So when you start to get into an argument with somebody, are you really listening to what they're saying, or are you reacting to something that it may have triggered in you that has nothing to do with what they said? So yeah, reacting would be, say somebody says something to you and you're automatically offended. Reacting is going, F you, why would you say that to me? A response would be to just stop and go, okay, I think that was insulting, but let me ask this person where they were coming from. I'm thinking that's really hard to do. And that would be to be more in the present, to be mindful, would be to stop for a minute and say, I don't exactly know what's going on in this person's head and why they said that to me. Before I react, let me respond and clarify. Why did you just say that to me? And oftentimes we heard it wrong. Oftentimes it came from our own ego or our own insecurities, what we thought we heard someone say, and they didn't mean it that way at all.
Yeah, I want
Does
to
that
share.
make
I want to share
sense?
something with you that I'm working on, and I'm not sure what I'll do with it, but you're really helping me think more about it. I'm working on something about what I'm calling healthy conflict, and I might switch it now to mindful conflict.
Hmm.
And the idea being, because let me run this by you and tell me what you think, and tell me if you think it has some potential. It seems like conflict appears to be universal. We get into a conflict with another person. We are the supervisor of two people in conflict, or you're the child of a mother and father who are arguing, so other people are in conflict, or we're in conflict with our own mind, we're beating up on ourselves for some reason. So the approach I'm taking is, what if every time we're in conflict, we see it as good instead of bad? Because most people say, oh, conflict is bad. So most people either get angry or they avoid it. And so the approach that I'm suggesting is, there's three things. If you can say in your head, opportunity for poise, because if you can show poise in the middle of conflict, people admire and respect that.
Oh, yeah.
And we're not talking about being robotic stiff, just being
Right.
calm. And there's a term that someone shared with me called radical patience.
Oh, I like that.
Well, I loved it. And so opportunity for poise, you say to yourself, Oh, this is a chance to build my poise muscle.
Yeah, I love it.
I need to be radically patient. And then the second thing is opportunity for empathy, and you apply it to yourself first and then the other person. What am I ticked off about? What am I really ticked off about?
Right.
What am I upset about? Uh, and you don't judge yourself. What am I disappointed about? What am I feeling
Mhm.
hurt? Whatever. Uh, and so you kind of talk yourself off a ledge. And then when you calm down, you are then curious about, well, what might they be angry about? What might they be disappointed about? What might they be hurt about? And so
Mhm.
it's opportunity for poise, opportunity for empathy. And then the third is opportunity for growth.
Mhm.
So that what you say to the other person is, let's hold on for a second, because I don't want to make this worse. I don't want to make it worse. I'm not sure how to make it better, but let's hold off for a second, because what I asked myself is what I'm so angry about, what I'm so offended about, what I'm so ticked
Mhm.
off about. And I think I figured that out. But then I asked myself, what are you so angry, upset, and disappointed about? And I came up with some things. Can I run them by you? And the other person might be curious. Well, what do you mean? Yeah, I think I figured out what you're angry, upset, and disappointed about, or
Mhm.
frustrated. Can I run them by you? And uh, and it doesn't happen all the time, but the other person might be curious because, yeah. So what do you think I'm upset, disappointed, angry about? And you can usually fill it in. I think
Yeah.
what you're angry at is, uh, especially this happens between a lot of marriages with
Mhm.
men often don't feel respected enough, by their spouses. They just, you know, uh, and it hurts when you feel disrespected as a man.
Mhm.
It's painful. It hurts when you feel disrespected as a woman also, but
Mhm. Yeah.
there's really something that triggers men when you know you when you talk to them like everything they do is wrong. Like, why'd you do that? That was stupid. You think,
Oh, yeah.
you know, uh, but I think if you go through those things, uh, and you just build that muscle, opportunity for poise, opportunity for empathy,
Yeah.
opportunity for growth, and if you go through those, I think there's a chance to be able to really deal with the conflict in a different way. So does any of that make sense? Because I'm just
It
working it out.
does. I think it has to be respect both ways, because I think if a woman is speaking to her husband that way, that she might not have respect for herself. I found my friend and I, we call it don't 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 create a story. Don't make up stories. I think it's a good, are you upset because of this? Are you upset because of that? That's not a bad idea. But I think even more importantly is to make sure that, I mean, there's been so many times I've thought this friend or that person was angry with me because of one thing or another. And it turns out either they weren't angry with me at all, or they were angry with me, but it had absolutely nothing to do with what I thought it was about. Like that hadn't even crossed their mind, what I thought they might have been upset about. So I think, that's part of mindfulness, is to make sure that you're listening, you're not making up stories, of why this person or that person is angry. And the thing that I came to my mind when you were talking about opportunity for poise, I started thinking about pause for poise. Put a little pause on, hit the pause button, and that's really easier said than done, because when you're in it, you're in it. Our fight or flight responses, that's the difference between reacting and responding. A reaction is your fight or flight response. Your fight or flight response is trying to keep you from getting killed. But I posted a meme that somebody else said this, but I shared it on my social media page, and it says, how do I tell my fight or flight response that its purpose is to keep me alive from getting killed? It's not supposed to be triggered when I'm just trying to make a phone call. Because so many people get so anxious, that they have social anxiety, they don't want to do or say the wrong thing. And their fight or flight response gets triggered. Um, really, it should be the fight or flight reaction, because that's what I want to say. Responding, that's, from the word responsible. So responding comes from a place of wisdom. It does come from that place where you stop for poise, right? You take that opportunity to poise yourself, and you stop for a minute and you access, your files in your head of, all the wisdom that you've had through all the conflict that you've gone through. The other thing I wanted to say about conflict, which I think you were kind of gravitating towards, is we don't grow without conflict.
Mhm.
You think about, the first cavemen who figured out how to light a fire or create fire. There's no fire without friction, and so there's no growing without friction either, whether we like it or not. If you're comfortable and you don't have any problems in your life and you're just sitting pretty, where are you going? You're not going to grow. You're just going to kind of stay there. So I think that's important, to not always look at conflict and difficulties as some kind of a negative thing. It's another opportunity for growth.
Yeah, I'll share something with you that and because you're a psychiatric and chemical dependency nurse, you'll probably understand this. And you're welcome to use it if you give talks. And you can give me credit or don't give me credit, but one of the single best tips I've discovered about how to deal with upset is, when I give talks, I'll say, how many of you have had a breakthrough in your life? A breakthrough is a good thing. Most people raise their hand. And then I say, how many of you have had more than 5 breakthroughs in your life? Most people keep their hands up. And I say, keep your hands up if the breakthrough was preceded by a breakdown that wasn't pleasant,
Right?
that was scary, that was not invited. And most of them keep their hands up. And I say, here's what happens to me is, when I get upset, it's like I have a breakdown. And something I learned as a psychiatrist is I put myself on a 72-hour hold. And I put myself in a 5150 and I say, don't do anything to make it worse for 72 hours. Because what will often happen is it'll lead to a breakthrough. But if I do something to make it worse for the 72 hours, I feel embarrassed. I have to apologize. I feel ashamed. And I'm so busy trying to undo my coping with making it worse that
Right.
I can miss the breakthrough.
Right. Right.
So
That's funny. That's even funny. You bring up 5150 holds. My last job as in a hospital setting, like I was doing case management as of recently, but my last position as a nurse in a hospital setting was, I was going all around Los Angeles and evaluating patients for 5150 holds. And a lot of the times, by the time I got to them, they had been like, oh boy, I really screwed up. I had a bad night and now here I am. I need to go home. Suddenly they're like ready to go home. I need to go pay my bills and feed my dog. Like, it didn't matter to them the night before. They were ready to, just leave the planet. But by the time I get them, a lot of times they've already been, because they have to be medically cleared, make sure there's not something else going on that is not psychiatric, like they're having a stroke or something. So once all that's been cleared and we know that their behavior is not because of some physical ailment, a lot of times they've already been in the hospital for 12 to 24 hours. And suddenly, now that they've been out of whatever situation they're in, they're sitting in this hospital bed, things start to come into perspective and they're just ready to go. They're ready. They're like hyper vigilant. I need to go pay my bills. I need to go pay my rent. My dog needs feeding, and it's kind of funny. Because that's all that they needed, was to get out of the situation for 12 to 24 hours, get a little perspective, and then respond instead of react to whatever trauma or upsetting situation was going on in their lives.
That
So I
reminds me,
think that's great advice.
I did my internship at Harbor General Hospital in Torrance, California.
Oh, okay.
And then I did psychiatry at UCLA up in Westwood. But I can remember when I was on call at Harbor General, I remember one patient came in. It's exactly what you were saying, and he was homeless. Uh, and in those days, you could put someone in a 72-hour hold if they uh, uh, were a danger to themselves, a danger to other people, or gravely impaired.
Yes,
So,
that's still the same.
uh, so what was interesting is because he was homeless and he lived in Long Beach, which was not that far away from
Right.
Torrance, but it was still sort of, I don't know how he made his way to Torrance, and they found him kind of on the street in Torrance. But as you say, several hours later, it's almost like the mechanism was, no, we're going to send him to Metropolitan Hospital, we're going to send him to blah 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 blah. And I
Yeah.
remember he said to me, he said, I don't have any money, I just need to get back to Long Beach, kind of sort of where I hang out and whatever. I said, how much would that cost? And he said, oh, about $7. And so I gave him $7, and I said, here, go back to Long Beach. And he was just so thankful. But sometimes things get so picked out of perspective. Oh,
Yes.
we filled out all the forms, and the next thing is such and such. Would have cost the county, probably, 1,000 or 2,000, and he was all set to just go back to Long Beach. That.
Yeah. Sometimes I just need, I really do feel our society is in need of a place that's not a church and not a hospital, but just some form of non-denominational, non-religious, like a temple of sorts, where people could just go and be quiet for a few moments without being bothered, without being questioned, and just to get things in perspective. And but I have to mention, you talking about UCLA and Torrance and all, we ran in the same circles, because that's where I was doing most of my nursing was Torrance, and I worked at Little Company of Mary in San Pedro for a while. So I just think that's interesting that you and I may have crossed paths and not realized it.
I remember it well. So here's something I ask my guests when they have a book, and it's something to keep in mind. I think what listeners listen for and readers read for are three things. So I'm going to ask you if you can give us whet our appetite with something from the book, and we may have already spoken about it, but see if it triggers anything.
Mm-hmm.
So the three things. The first thing is people read something, and what they want to respond with is, I never would have thought of that ever, and that's relative to my situation. That's relevant. So I never would have thought of that. The second thing is, that could actually work to help me in my situation. And then the third is some specific little tactic to set them on their way, so they could say, I'm going to get started, and some first step. So can you think of something from the book that readers will say, geez, I never would have looked at it that way, I never would have thought of it that way, I think that would help me in a lot of situations. And then give them a tip. Well, one of the ways to start you on your way is such and such. So I hate to put you on the spot, but I'm putting you on the spot.
Okay. Yeah, that does put me on the spot. Okay, so what was the first one again? Let's start with the first one.
Well, it's kind of it's like when I hit you with opportunity for poise, as a way of looking at conflict. My hope or my guess is you would have said, I never would have thought of it that way. I like that. And you can pause to get that poise. Oh, that's terrific. So that is something that's counterintuitive, meaning I never would have thought of that. Gee, I'm going to try to apply that. The next time I'm in some sort of conflict or with my husband or
Mhm.
someone else, I'll hear you say, oh, what did Mark say? Opportunity for poise. Well, I'm
Mhm.
pissed off, but opportunity for poise. I could build that muscle. And what did I say to him? Oh, I just have to pause. Oh, I could do that.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
give us a little something from the book that sort of fits that formula.
Sure. So when we're talking, a lot of times, I think when we talk about mindfulness and making sure you're living in the present, a
Mhm.
lot of people will mistake that for live in the moment, which is kind
Mhm.
of impulsive and not necessarily always healthy, because it doesn't mean that you're not planning for the future, and it doesn't mean that you're not learning from your past to live in the present. What I wish I had, I this concept kind of came to me after I wrote the book. Well, when I say to live in the present and be mindful, it also means not to steal from the future. So doing things like, you want to plan for the future, you don't want to steal from it. One of the things that I went through when I was younger, was I kind of had this voice teacher that, I was a singer and I sang in bands, and she really believed that I was going to have a career as a singer. It never really occurred to me even if I wanted that, but I was putting a lot of things on my credit card at that time in my life, thinking, oh, I'm going to get a record deal someday and I'll be rich and famous. um and and when I look back now, I felt like I look at it as a stealing from the future, and not even respecting where I was on my journey. Like, why not enjoy just learning how to sing and singing in bands? And you want to plan for the future, but I was counting on the future to bail me out of debt at some point. That's some way that about planning that I had never really thought of before until after I wrote the book and was talking about it with a lot of people, was, you know, protect your future self. Don't steal from your future self.
I
And
love
in
that.
that way you can be mindful. Yeah.
Yeah, before you spoke about that, I loved something else you said. Maybe you can elaborate on it. Uh, Being mindful and being present is not the same as what did you say about living in
Just
the
living in the moment, not living in the present. But I think when people are living in the moment, there's this sort of idea that, well, I might die tomorrow anyway, so I may as well drink all these beers right now, or I may as well, jump off this cliff, or into the ocean, or whatever. Or like in my case, I was just charging up my credit cards when I was in college with no real plan of how they were going to get paid off in the future. So I think that's the difference. One is a little bit more reactive again, and the other one is a little bit more responsible. Think about taking care of your future self, and it could even be little things, like even when I find things like when I'm grocery shopping, or, doing my laundry, or picking out my outfit to wear the next day so that I'm not stressed out in the morning if I have to be somewhere early in the morning and I have all these things to think about. To me, those are like taking care of your future self, not leaving problems and things till later, but sort of addressing what's in the moment without ignoring your future self. You want to take care of your future self.
I love that. I'll
Yeah.
share something because this is a conversation. I'll share
Mhm.
something that I learned from an interview I heard, and someone was interviewing Jeff Immelt when he was the CEO of GE, and
Mm.
unfortunately, GE has fallen apart, and he's probably
Yeah.
a lot of blame. But this was way back when, and someone asked him, um, "What's the secret to getting a raise or a promotion?" And I think you'll like this, but I loved it. He said, "Focus on what you're doing right now as if you'll be doing it all of your life and become excellent at it."
Mm.
As opposed to racing ahead. Oh, what's my next deal? What's my next job? What's my such and such? And
Right.
he basically said, if you can
Mm.
become excellent in something, excellent as a valet parker or a dishwasher or whatever, he said, the world notices excellence more than what you're excellent at.
This is true. That's my husband's philosophy, and I think he's a genius for that. He says, I don't care if I have a job that I hate. I'm going to be the best damn person at that job. You will always feel good about yourself if you're doing the best that you can at something. And he always is everyone's favorite employee wherever he works. I mean, he didn't like his last job. He was, and here's a good example of looking in the direction you want to go, not where you don't want to go. My husband was working in a job where he was basically in a delivery car by himself a lot, sitting in traffic. And we were living in New Jersey at the time. And then we moved to LA. And then he said out loud, I don't want another job where I'm sitting in traffic alone by myself, not talking to anybody. So guess what happened? He got a job sitting alone in traffic because that's what he said. Now he was doing this such a great job at it, even though he hated it. His boss asked him one day, are you happy in this job? You're really good at it, but you have so many skills and I could really use you. I had asked him, I said, you're back at a job because you described to the universe the job that you didn't want, and then you ended up with it again. What do you want to do? He said he was working at a motorcycle dealership, and he said, God, I would really love to just be working in the shop with the guys, even if I was just answering phones and helping them out, helping my manager out. I just don't want to be alone. I want to be around people and joke around it. And guess what? His boss ended up offering him a job doing just that, being his assistant in the shop, with the other guy. So again, it goes back to looking in the direction you want to go, not where you don't want to go. And that's another one of my principles. And what you were asking me about what my book really has to offer. Every single chapter in my book is based on one of these little life lessons that I learned from my motorcycle that can be applied to life. So doing what you're doing, focusing on doing what you're doing and doing things in the right order. That's exactly what you're saying. If you're just going to do what you do, be the best at what you're doing. Don't be thinking like, oh, I'm going to be so much happier when I get my promotion, or I'll be so much happier when I'm making $200 million. If you're not making that $200 million right now, then what are you going to be happy about right now? Because that's really the only moment that you have. If you're not making $200 million yet, because then you're basically putting a price tag on your happiness. Like, I'm not going to be happy until I'm doing this, or I'm not going to be happy until I'm doing that. My husband's philosophy was, well, even if it's a job I'm not crazy about, I'm going to do the best at it that I can. And I feel like that's in a way what brings him peace and mindfulness, and why I admire him so much.
One of the purposes of the podcast, and I hope it's been okay with you, is it wanders all over the place. And the purpose is to whet the appetite of my listeners, because they like your personality, which is highly likable. They believe you and believe in you. And so they're going to want more. And you've knocked it out of the park with all of those things. And so if you're listening in, if you're like me, Leslie is more than whet my appetite to find out more about her, what she's doing, what her next book's going to be, what this book is about. So if you're listening in, really do check out the Zen of Learning to Ride a Motorcycle. And where can people find that and find you?
They can find my book pretty much anywhere books are sold online. It is available at Amazon. It's available at Barnes and Noble. I've seen it for sale at Walmart. So if you would prefer to go to the library, you can ask your librarian to order it. It is available that way as well. And if you'd like to follow me on social media or anything like that, you can find me at the Zen of Learning to Ride a Motorcycle.com, as well as Leslie Reyes Author.com. And that's LeslieReyes author.com.
Well, you've been terrific. You've been a delight. I hope this was as enjoyable and informative for you as it was for me.
It was. I'm going to start pausing for poise.
Pause for poise.
Yeah.
You can create T-shirts with that on with the cover on one side and the other, don't forget to pause for poise.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And I do want to mention my book. Each chapter, it's 10 chapters, and each chapter is one of those little life principles, like look in the direction you want to go, not where you don't want to go. And I have a little life story about how I did that and how it applied to my motorcycle and how it applied to life. So I really, I wrote that book in the hopes that people can start talking about their challenges and not be afraid to. Sometimes you have to lean into it, like when you are going through a rough time, like you said, those breakthrough moments in our life were never preceded by something easy.
Mm-hmm.
As you said.
Yeah, something I'll leave you with, because it fits your book better than almost all the books that other authors have talked about. When I'm coaching people and they get upset, one of the other things I say to them to help them be able to think about opportunity for poise, I tell them to think in their mind downshift.
Yes.
Because when you downshift, you increase the torque in a motorcycle. You
right.
up the RPMs, but you pull the road towards you. Whereas if you step on the accelerator, you're going to go off the cliff. So if you can just say to yourself when you're catching yourself getting upset, downshift.
Yes, downshift. You don't want to be barreling down a steep hill into a curve. We need to downshift, and that's the subtitle of my book. You can see in the eyeglasses is how I shifted gears. Yeah,
I love that.
I faced my fears and shifted gears and found healing from anxiety, codependency, and depression. So, yes, shifting gears is very important.
That is true. So thank you, Leslie. And to our listeners, thank you for listening to another episode. It helps if you share this with other people who you think will benefit from it. And also, we really appreciate your writing reviews on Apple Podcasts. And when wake-up calls come your way, wake up and be mindful, be present, and shift gears so that you can take full advantage of it. Take care, everyone.